Hello and welcome back to another edition of GNAT-TV's In-Depth series. I'm Andrew McKeever. It is Wednesday, April 16th, and it is our great pleasure and honor to have with us today in our virtual studio Secretary of State Sarah Copeland Hanzas, who is here with us today to talk a little bit about the Civic Health Index. That was a report that was released this past January, a couple of months ago, and the Vermont Civic Health Index assesses the strengths and needed improvements in a number of areas here in the state: volunteerism and donating, political, community and social interaction, cultural access, and media and government trust. Secretary Copeland Hanzas, again, thank you very much for making the time for this conversation. I think it's certainly a very important topic. And I guess just to get us started, could you kind of walk us through some of the high points or highlights of the Civic Health Index, and what does it tell us about Vermont?
Thank you so much for the great question, and I love being able to talk about the Civic Health Index. This was a really important initiative of our new civics program. When I was first elected and sworn into office in 2023, I hired a civics director, and we set about to really think about all of the ways that we can make sure that Vermonters are ready and educated and able to participate in their democracy, in their communities. The Civic Health Index was really an important measure for us to understand the extent to which Vermonters are currently engaged in their communities. So the National Conference on Citizenship has done civic health indexes for 38 different states, and we were excited to be their next project. They take a lot of data points, mainly around the supplemental census data, and use that to compare your state to how other states rank, and how do people in Vermont engage compared to people in other states in the country. So some of the big highlights or takeaways from this rough data is that Vermont really ranks very high in terms of civic engagement. We rank high in terms of people attending a public meeting or talking with neighbors about community issues or social issues or political issues. We rank fairly high in terms of media trust and access. But what's really interesting about the data when you dig into it is, we may rank second in the nation in a particular category, for instance, attending a public meeting, which shouldn't come to any surprise to Vermonters, since many of our towns still govern themselves by having a town meeting every year. But the number of Vermonters who report attending a public meeting was still just under 18%. So even though we rank second in the country, there still is a lot of room for improvement in terms of people who are able to access those public meetings. And particularly now, when many of our towns and cities are doing Zoom formats for their regular select board meetings, and many of our cable access channels are covering those local municipal meetings and broadcasting them. I certainly hope that we can see an increase in the number of people who report that they are attending those public meetings. And engaging in local communities to come together and solve problems is really what civics is all about. One of the things that we did in Vermont's Civic Health Index that was new and unique, and in fact the executive director of NCOC says he'd like to see other states follow, is we did a supplemental survey of young Vermonters. We wanted to really unpack and understand, what do our 7th through 12th grade Vermonters say about their own civic engagement, about the extent to which they talk about community or societal issues with their peers, and where do they get their news, and how do they feel welcomed into participating in our government. And so we got about 2,500 survey results back from young people in Vermont, which is a fabulous turnout, and I think really strong indication of how our young people are thinking and feeling about civic engagement. And then we brought a group of high school students to the State House for a facilitated day where they looked at the data, the survey results, and really unpacked it, and were able to say, yes, this rings true, or no, this doesn't, and this is where we should dig in a little bit more. So our Civic Health Index, which is available on the Secretary of State's website, does include a lot of information about how young people in Vermont engage. And, by and large, we see young people, tracking fairly similarly to adults. Young people tend to volunteer at higher rates than adults do. But of course, many of those volunteer opportunities are built in because when you're involved in schools and clubs and sports, there are volunteer opportunities. We see a lot of that volunteerism drop off with people in the 20 to 40 age range. And then it picks up again as you see people maybe heading into retirement with maybe a slightly more comfortable daily or weekly schedule and able to do a little bit more volunteering. But we do see lots of places where Vermont needs to continue working on things. And part of the process of doing this Civic Health Index that has been most important to me is really taking this information out to communities and asking for people's ideas and feedback. What should we do with this information? How should we focus our energy on engagement and civic education going forward? So we're starting to compile a list of ideas of where to go next, and really looking forward to coming to a few more communities wherever there's someone who would like to host a meeting about the Civic Health Index. We would love to come and bring the presentation and engage for some more feedback. But we've got some ideas started, and we're excited to move forward.
I was wondering, why do you think it is, or were you able to learn when you looked at some of the other responses from different states, why different states have different levels of civic engagement? I mean, clearly, I guess it grows out of the culture and history of individual states, kind of, and all that. But is there something unusual about Vermont that makes it different from, let's say, I don't know, Illinois, that makes civic engagement higher or lower here?
I think the extent to which Vermonters have traditionally and historically, known who their neighbors are, right? When you live in a rural state and, the houses may be a little bit more dispersed, Vermonters still tend to know who their neighbors are, and the proverbial borrowing a cup of sugar does still happen in Vermont communities, and we also have to survive nasty hard winters and the deep ruts of mud season. And I don't know about you, but I can tell you a dozen instances where either I needed help or a neighbor needed help, and that's just one of those things that you do when you're out on the road in a rural community. And maybe in more urban areas you would be thinking about your own safety and you would decide to drive along and call 911. In Vermont, we generally stop and help, and that gives us, I think, an inclination towards connecting with our neighbors.
One of the interesting aspects of this, and you alluded to it a moment ago, the youth engagement here in the state. I see that only 59% of young folks indicated they expect to register to vote when they became eligible. Is that kind of a typical average, or is that standard? Is that good? Is that not so good? Is it your feeling that should be close to 100%, or what?
Yeah, I would hope that result would be closer to 100%. And I think that that's one of the areas that we will certainly look at and focus on in order to understand a little bit more, and in order to make sure that we're giving young people the opportunity to register to vote as soon as they're eligible to. We do have automatic voter registration at the Department of Motor Vehicles, so we certainly hope some of these young people will find themselves automatically registering because they're getting their driver's license. But it is a little bit concerning to see that 40% of kids don't intend to register to vote, and we'd like to see kids being educated on what voting means and how voting works and why it's important. And I'm wondering if that's maybe part of that gap.
Well, one part of the survey that caught my attention was the part on the media trust and access. I guess no surprise there. And there I was surprised to find out that we ranked second in the nation in the number of people who report they read or watch or listen to news or information about politics or local issues. About 79% Vermonters. And that compares to a national average of closer to 67%. I guess I was quite frankly surprised. I mean, I'm not surprised that a lot of people are interested in those things, but there's been such turmoil, I guess would not be too strong a word to say, in terms of the news industry over the past 20 or so years, with the arrival of the internet and social media, and the fact that newspapers that used to be trusted sources of information and basically the primary sources of information for residents in their communities have been substantially weakened by industrial trends. So what do you think needs to happen to ensure that trust in the media kind of continues at what seems to be a relatively high level? I mean, is there anything that we need to do to make sure that that kind of splintering and fragmentation of the news environment isn't worse?
Well, for sure, and I think you hit the nail right on the head, that there have been these trends within the industry, if you will, the industry of news and journalism, that have led to fewer and fewer news outlets covering what's happening. And so, since I came into office, we have been supporting the cable access channels. We also put our endorsement behind a bill in the legislature this year that is aimed at asking the state to spend 70% of its required advertising dollars with local media institutions, because right now we don't know where those required ads are being placed, but we figure if we can at least commit as a state government to placing these ads with local news entities, that will be a revenue stream for them, and it's money that the state has to spend anyway. So it's a way that we can support local journalism that doesn't cost the state an additional dollar. That bill was very strongly supported by news outlets that range from WCAX, at the big end of the spectrum, all the way down to local newspapers who could use that advertising revenue to help support the journalism that allows them to cover what's happening in their local communities. So, there are things that we can do as a state, and that I can do as Secretary of State to draw attention to the importance of these news outlets to cover our local issues. Because if you don't have a newspaper in your local community, then it becomes a whole lot harder to understand what your select board is doing. So we need to really protect the remaining outlets that we have in Vermont.
Yeah, I mean, this is a subject I run into all the time. A lot of the smaller communities around here definitely strike me as being something close to news deserts, where there's not a primary paper, and people seem to be relying more and more on social media or Facebook, it makes you kind of wonder, are they reading all of that with a discriminatory perspective or not? I mean, another area that the report looked at was government trust and access. And apparently here that seems to be some good news, that Vermonters' confidence in local government is, well, much greater than the national government. I suppose that's not terribly unusual. I mean, historically speaking, I suppose that's been the case. But was there anything in the report in that area that stood out to you?
Well, I think it was reassuring to see that Vermonters do have a strong sense of, positive about their local government, and then to a slightly lesser extent to their state government. It is concerning that when you look at the question of do you have trust in your federal government, that drops off precipitously. I think part of the frustration that people have is in not understanding how to influence what's happening in Washington, D.C. And of course, that becomes easier if you are talking about something that your select board is working on, because you probably know how to get a hold of your select board member. You probably can find out how to get a hold of your state senator or your state representative if you hear about something happening in Montpelier. But it is much harder for people to navigate, contacting folks in DC. And of course, little old Vermont might have one idea of what Congress should be doing, but we might be a very small minority, and Congress might go in a different direction that Vermonters feel frustrated about. And so that's sort of one of the realities of being a very small state.
I guess the good news is that we're only, 2 or 3 degrees of separation from here to the governor's office, but 5,000 degrees of separation to Washington. But I wanted to kind of just circle back a bit to that question we were talking about earlier around youth engagement and civics education. This is a subject we've talked about a couple of times here. And it's been one I've been sort of following with even greater interest in the last couple of months. Do you think there's any way, and I guess this probably would be a good question for Zoe Saunders at the Agency of Education to ask, but to incorporate more civics education into school curriculums? My understanding is that when the No Child Left Behind legislation first was introduced back in the early 2000s, that placed more emphasis on things like reading and math skills, and that began to crowd out what courses on civics or social studies classes that leaned into that were able to provide, and that kind of got compressed a little bit. I'm not sure if that's the case. I've heard that argument made. But do you think at this point in time that we are at a point where making more room in curriculums, at least at the high school or middle school level, is back to being something important?
Well, it's certainly something that we are talking about, and that we see value in. We are engaging with social studies teachers from across the state to try at this moment to share best practices, to share lessons with a broader swath of teachers across the state, so that we have more kids having access to a basic understanding of how government works and how we organize ourselves to fix a problem, which is essentially what government is supposed to do. And so we are certainly hoping that we can get to a point where we're having a more robust conversation with educational leadership about how to ensure that that is available to every student in Vermont, because right now it seems that it's more contingent upon there being an adult in that building who really feels that civics and understanding how government works is a priority, as opposed to it being baked into, these are the requirements of our curriculum. So there's a couple of things that we would like to work on in future years. Number one, there's a great program that is available to 5th graders across the country It's called the Kid Governor Program, and each school would run their own individual Kid Governor contest, and then we would have a statewide Kid Governor election as well. That seems to be a really great way to introduce kids to the concept of how you get elected, right? Getting elected simply means you tell your peers what you would want to do. What's the problem I want to fix? How do I want to fix it? This is my platform, if you will. So having a basic understanding of how you do that is pretty important in the civics realm. The other thing that we're looking into is creating a civic seal for your high school graduation diploma. And so this would be, a set of activities or, things that young people would do during their high school career. And if they checked off enough of the items on the list, they would earn a civic seal on their graduation diploma. Often, if you gamify it or make it into a contest, people get more excited to get into it and participate. We certainly see that with the Good News Challenge that 7 Days does in the summertime. Kids love the idea of trying to fill in every one of those bingo squares by doing these different activities. And so we think between Kid Governor and Civic Seal that it will raise the profile in kids' minds and hopefully parents' minds, which may trickle up to the school board level where we might be able to make some real policy changes about the importance of civics. I said it before, and it always bears repeating that civics is really how do we organize ourselves to fix a problem that's too big for any one of us to fix on our own, right? And in this day and age, when we can tick off any number of concerns or challenges or problems out there in the world that need attention, to have our young people graduating from school with absolutely no understanding about how you organize together to fix a problem is really disheartening. And it leaves young people feeling despair that they don't know how to change the world and nobody's fixing, this problem that means so much to me. And so I think that it's really a disservice that we do when we skip over this important part of their education.
My own feeling is, I guess I think that for a long time we allowed ourselves to take all that for granted, that the democracy was permanent, that there would never be any kind of danger, that the kind of government we had known about for almost 250 years would be somehow or another not the way it was. And but clearly the challenges of the 21st century are certainly putting that assumption to a test, it seems like.
I think we're discovering some of the shortfall of not having an educated and prepared electorate.
Well, if we have some kid governors, we'll have to have them down here to the studio, and I'd love to hear what their platforms would be. What would be their priorities if elected governor? And
to any fifth grade teachers who might be watching, or to any people who know a fifth grade teacher, we'll be in touch because we want to try to get at least every single county represented by a school that's participating in the Kid Governor program. And so we hope it'll be your school.
Well, okay, we'll definitely have them here to have a little debate of some sort or another.
There
whatever.
we go. Oh, that's a great incentive, a chance to be on TV.
Yeah, right. I mean, it doesn't get any better than that. Well, before we have to run, I did want to just take a couple of minutes to ask you about another issue that has kind of popped up a little bit, and that revolves around this piece of legislation that's currently going through the U.S. Congress called the SAVE Act. We did have last week on our one of our programs the vice president of the Vermont League of Women Voters who came to talk about it, and very concerned about some of the provisions of the bill. And I understand that you're also somewhat concerned about this piece of legislation too. It recently passed through the U.S. Congress. It's now over in the U.S. Senate. But what is it about the SAVE Act that has you has you concerned?
Well, there's so many layers to that question. It's going to feel like peeling an onion,
Sorry.
and we'll try not to tear up as one sometimes does when they're dealing with onions. No, it's really concerning. From the standpoint of the chief elections official who is responsible for supporting and equipping and helping to train all of the local election officials. I can tell you that this is bringing up a lot of fear and anxiety among our town and city clerks, and rightly so, because this would be a huge new mandate for them to collect documents and information from their voters in a way that they've never been required to in the past. It would require us to develop a very safe portal within our election management system where images of all of those important documents could be captured and stored. And obviously the security around storing somebody's birth certificate and marriage certificate or passport image or driver's license, those are all very very important documents that we would want to make sure were never made available to someone who shouldn't have access to them. And the executive order and the SAVE Act, which are largely the same, would criminalize registering someone to vote in the absence of gathering all of that proper documentation. And so what that essentially means is your town clerk, who has known Mrs. Jones for her entire life, might be forced to say to her, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Jones, I know you were born here, you've lived across the street from me, for my entire life, for your entire life, I can't register you to vote because you don't have a certified copy of your birth certificate that matches the name on your driver's license." And so then, rural Vermonters, elderly Vermonters, women in particular, although some men do change their name when they get married, many women have changed their name when they were married, would be required to collect all of this documentation and present it in person for verification by the town or city clerk. So, Andrew, do you have a copy of your original birth certificate?
I think so. Where it is exactly, I'm not sure. I do have a current new passport, so that's
Yes,
that's the other one.
then you are among the advantaged few, relatively few Vermonters have a passport. If you have a passport, then you probably will be all set because the passport does indicate citizenship. But many Vermonters don't intend to travel internationally and can't afford the $150 or $200 that it costs to get a passport. And so they would have to take this more circuitous route to get their documentation together, including ordering an original copy of your birth certificate, because I know what my original birth certificate looks like, and it really looks like something you could have made on your typewriter at home. And so I needed to order a new certified copy of my birth certificate. I started that process, March 27th, and I still don't have a copy of my birth certificate. So, that's been a couple of weeks, and that is a huge barrier. If I forgot that an election was coming and didn't order my documents in time, I might be precluded from being able to vote.
What puzzles me about this is that it strikes me as being sort of a solution in search of a problem. I mean, what is this supposed to be fixing? Does this grow out of some of the conspiracy theories we're hearing about after the 2020 election, where there were all these ineligible voters who were casting ballots and so forth and so on, and this is supposed to be a measure that would make sure that whoever votes and casts a ballot is a legitimate voter? Or is the number of people that potentially are illegal voters so tiny and insignificant that they're not going to affect the outcomes of elections?
So I think this absolutely is coming out of the conspiracy theories, and that's a kind way of saying it. I'm going to say it a little more directly. The outright lies about whether people who are non-citizens are voting in American elections. The Brennan Center for Justice has done a study of elections across the entire country, and have found that statistically speaking, the instances of a non-citizen or ineligible person actually casting a ballot is 0.0001%. And so if you do the math with, 375,000 voters in Vermont, it would take us 6 years or 3 election cycles to get to one whole person, one whole vote being cast by someone who accidentally made it onto the voter registration rolls. The reason this is so rare, and the reason it is just a bald-faced lie to imply that people are stealing our elections by registering to vote when they're not eligible, is that if you are living here and working here, maybe you're raising your family here, maybe you've come here from somewhere else and you're sending money home to support your family at home. The last thing that you want to do if you like living here is to risk a deportable offense and risk never being able to be eligible for citizenship by casting one ballot. I mean, the thought that you would ever have the influence to change the outcome of an election, and that there are enough people who are willing to risk their current situation in the United States in order to cast a ballot, it's just preposterous. And it's shown out by the data. And we understand that there are times when people accidentally get on the voter registration rolls. We've seen a few instances, and what ends up happening is that person will call and say, please take me off the voter registration list. This must have been a mistake that happened when I was renewing my driver's license. I don't want to be on this voter registration roll. People understand that voting when you are not a citizen is not legal. And the way we have done this has given us good results so far. Our elections are not being impacted by people who are not eligible to vote. And the thought that we would risk disenfranchising and in actuality significantly inconvenience every single voter in Vermont in the name of that 0.0001% chance that a non-citizen might get on the voter registration rolls is outrageously unfair.
Well, so I guess currently the bill then, like, as I said, is crossed over to the U.S. Senate, where I guess we'll wait and see whether or not they take it up and how far it travels. I mean, I suppose this is also a bill that could be filibustered, and the math in the Senate probably makes it unlikely it's ever going to pass. But I guess that's why we have executive orders, right?
Well, and the executive order has been challenged by our Attorney General, and 18 other states have joined in on that suit. It is pretty clear that you cannot change election law by executive order. Our Constitution, the United States Constitution, says very clearly that the states shall determine the time, place, and manner of federal elections, and that only Congress can put parameters around that by passing legislation through both chambers and having it signed by the president. So we certainly hope that the executive order will be dispatched relatively quickly, and that calmer heads will prevail in the Senate, and that the SAVE Act will not advance. Because, honestly, at the end of the day, Andrew, if we decide as a nation that it's important for people to be able to verify citizenship in order to be on the voter registration rolls, then we need a government entity to provide that verification to us as citizens at no expense. And right now, the way this is set up, it is all expense that is borne by the individual voter. And if you don't have the time to research how to get your documents, if you don't have the money to write that check, to get your certified copies, if you can't take time off of work to sit in front of your town clerk and provide that documentation, then you're going to be denied your right to vote if this passes. And so I think calmer heads will prevail in the Senate, and that the federal government will figure out how to provide this if they think it's important.
Okay. Well, I guess we'll have to leave it there for today, but once again, Secretary of State Sarah Copeland Hanzas, thank you very much for making the time to be with us and share your thoughts on these important subjects. Well, we'll certainly be interested to see where this all goes. Anyway.
Thank you very much.
And thanks to all of you who've been with us today. I hope you found the show interesting, and we'll see you again the next time. Take care.